Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line, both in favor of the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have managed to regain control over Torske in its entirety following a Russian withdrawal from the town after the Ukrainians managed to operationally encircle them for 2 weeks, heavily pressuring the Russian forces due to the lack of supply and their inability to regain control over the flanks of the town. The remaining soldiers were forced to withdraw under heavy Ukrainian fire, which likely resulted in a lot of Russian casualties, similar to when the Ukrainians are operationally encircled. The Ukrainians also managed to re-enter the Kursk region to the south of Sucha in an attempt to re-enter the towns from across the marsh area. The Ukrainians continued offensive operations into the Kursk region in the direction of Titlino, where they continued their attempts to cut off the supplies to the town, while the Russians launched a small counterattack to free up some of the positions near the supply line to secure the flank. The Ukrainians are widening the front line in the area. In turn, the Russians managed to advance within the Sumy region, storming a new town of Yablonivka and gaining control over the town of Novokoshentinivka. The Russians also managed to advance in the direction of Yablonivka in the Donetsk region, not the same as the one in the Sumy region. At the same time, I've looked over the footage from the Ukrainian web offensive, which was the operation to strike Russian air bases across Russia, of which 3 out of 6 succeeded. We can see the satellite imagery from some of the bases, except for the Olenia one, where we had the original footage from the FPV drones themselves sourced. So we see from the Olenia direction, the Olenia airbase in Murmansk in northern Russia. The Ukrainians destroyed approximately 4 bombers of the Russian Air Force. At the same time, the Ukrainians launched 2 strikes, one south of Moscow and one further south. One of them failed, which is the one in the Ryazan Air Base, where we can see the satellite imagery here, where all of the jets, the bombers, all of them are whole intact. There is some fire, traces of fire in one of the fields right next to an Su-30 SM, which shows the attack took place, but also that it failed. So this so far brings the total to 4 bombers being destroyed. Then there is the Belaya Air Base, which is deep within Russian territory, within Siberia. From this, we have 3 separate pieces of satellite imagery. The first one shows 1 destroyed bomber. The second one, in a second location in the airbase, shows additional 3 bombers destroyed. And the fourth one shows an additional 3. So this is a total of 7 in this airbase, the Belaya Air Base deep within Russian territory, within Siberia. Finally, there is this low-resolution Chinese satellite imagery from the Severny Air Base, where we see 3 what is said to be A-50 early warning radar jets being destroyed in northern parts. Although it is unclear because of the low resolution, it is likely that several aircraft were destroyed here as well. From the 4 in Olenia, the 7 in Belaya, and potentially 3 or more in Severny, while the Ryazan one failed. This brings the total to approximately 15 jets destroyed or damaged at the minimum based on the footage we have seen. So based on this, we can see that it was a very successful strike by the Ukrainians. However, it is still much lower than the claims by the Ukrainian forces up to 40 or 45. 33 or 35% of the Russian bomber fleet is definitely not true. 3 of which are early warning radar systems, which are much more important, but it also means that the bomber fleet itself likely has seen about 10% or less hit on their capacity and size, compared to the fact that they have 120 or so in reserve. It shows that the Russian bombing capability has likely not been lowered at all. The real question is whether or not the Ukrainians will be able to repeat such an operation. If they're able to repeat such an operation and destroy more and more of the Russian bomber fleet, then they have tapped into an very high potential, as it could significantly limit Russian long-range strikes. But if it is something that will take a year and a half every time to plan, or if it is something that they cannot repeat consistently, then the impact that they have had has had a shock effect, but not much more than that. The Ukrainians also launched a large-scale underwater drone attack on the Kerch bridge, as we see with this footage here, which was released by the Ukrainian Secret Services. However, this is pretty much all that happened with the strike. This is practically the only one that passed through. The Ukrainian targets was the supports of the bridge, but as of today, the traffic is as usual within the Kerch bridge, and it has really had no impact on the bridge itself. So this means that in general, the attack did not have any significant effect, and the bridge is operating as usual. Now on to the frontline situation. Over the past few months, the Ukrainians have not had a lot of success on the front line. However, with the fighting in Torske, they've been able to hold on to the town for a long time, and now they've been able to regain full control of it. The Russians initially pushed from the north and eastern flanks. This allowed them to gain a foothold within the town and drive deep within it to the central parts of it. The Ukrainians launched a counterattack, regaining control over the fish farms, which allowed them to cut off the northern roads, and at the end of May, they managed to counterattack in the eastern flank as well, cutting off the road there as well. Over the past 2 weeks, the Russians have been unable to properly supply their forces, as the only road here to the north was under fire control by the Ukrainian forces in the northern and eastern flanks. This allowed the Ukrainians to operationally encircle the Russian forces present within the town. At some point, it was reported by Russian military bloggers that they have managed to recapture the fish farm. One reliable source that I have that talks directly with Russian soldiers at some point said the same, but it turns out that due to the language barrier and the translation errors, it turned out that this was an ironic joke based on the Russian military bloggers that just sprout BS, kept talking about the fish farm being under Russian control. He made a joke about it, and I misunderstood. This led to me thinking that the fish farm had been captured by the Russian forces and the supply route from the north had been opened. However, it was then cleared up as he deleted that post, and since then, the Russians have been kicked out of Torske. They were forced to withdraw due to the operational encirclement and the lack of supplies, and this shows that the Ukrainians held on to the fish farm since they counterattacked and regained control of it, and has allowed them to, with the control over both flanks, operationally encircle the Russian forces and prevent them from taking control over the town. The Russians continue their attempts to gain control over the fish farms in the north of Torske. This will open up the road for the offensive operations in the northern direction. However, this time around, it is likely that they will work on consolidating their positions, clearing all the basements, and clearing the underground routes into the north of Torske from across the river line in Zareshne. To the south, in the direction of Kościanivka, the Russians advance in the direction of Yablanivka to the south of the town, as we see with this located footage. The Russians have been advancing alongside the south of the town, where they're widening the front line in the direction of it, where they're looking to gain control over the roads leading into the town from the western and southern directions for wide assault towards it. The Ukrainians still have fortified positions on the high ground to the north of the town, which the Russians are fighting over on the northern bank of the river line along the TO504 highway. To the southwest of this, the Russians are planning to gain control over Myrne. However, so far they've been unable to do so. With this footage here, we see heavy bombing by the Russian forces using FAB bombs on the Ukrainian positions within the town, flattening the town completely. The objective of the Russians here is not just to gain control over the town, but to prevent the Ukrainians from counterattacking from the direction of Myrne. The objective is to secure the western flank of Melinivka for flanking maneuvers to the fortified positions to the south. The Russians are planning on gaining control of these fortified positions by encircling the Ukrainian forces. However, to do so, they would also need to secure the western flank, because if they launch these operations and the Ukrainians launch a counterattack, they may be able to dislodge the Russian forces from the western flank of Melinivka. To secure their flanks, they're completely wiping off Myrne, which is a small town which the Ukrainians are present within both in the basements and within the few houses within the settlements, the forest lines in the area. Wiping up the village will allow the Russians to have a secure flank for the operations to gain control of fortified positions, which are very heavily fortified along the forest lines here to the northwest of Yelisavetivka. Gaining control of these fortified positions connecting the roads between Myrolyovivka and Melinivka will allow the Russians to launch offensive operations in the western directions or keep a defensive line for offensive operations to the north in the direction of Kopcheve, Shevchenko-Perche, Novotoretsk, and further north along the fortified line of the Ukrainians northeast of Pokrovsk. In the northern section of the front line in the direction of the Sumy and Kursk regions, the Ukrainians counterattacks in the direction of Guevo regain control over parts of the marsh area to the south of the town. The Ukrainians are here looking to re-enter Guevo from across the river line and to cut off the supplies to the Russian forces here to the west in the direction of Kornel. However, the Russians are also attempting to storm Alexandria from the southern flank near Kornel. The objective is to cut off the Ukrainian positions by gaining control of Alexandria, gaining a foothold within the Sumy region for offensive operations in the direction of Myropilya, which is the main supply hub for the Ukrainian forces acting here in the northern direction. The Ukrainians are launching counterattacks towards these positions to prevent the Russians from gaining a foothold within Alexandria, and at the same time to launch offensive operations in the direction of Guevo. The Ukrainians are here forced to cross over a Sel River and the marsh area, which makes it difficult for offensive operations, which raises questions as to the practicality of such an operation, slightly based on the unexpectedness of such an operation to lead to some sort of success. So far, we're seeing that the Ukrainians have managed to break through the initial line of defense of the Russian forces here along the border area. However, there is no footage or evidence so far of the Ukrainians entering Guevo. There are some reports suggesting that a few infantry crews have made it into the town where fighting is taking place. To the west, the Russians have managed to gain a foothold within Yablonivka, getting control over the first street in the northern parts of the town, and fighting continues within it. Gaining control over Yablonivka will allow the Russians to flank the town of Yunikivka, cut off the supply road, and operationally encircle the town, which is the main supply hub of the Ukrainian forces in this section of the front line. Getting control of Yunikivka will allow the Russians to significantly strengthen their offensive operations in this section of the front line, as they'll have that as their own major supply hub in this direction. The Russians also stormed the town of Novokoshentinivka, which is just a few buildings within a forest patch area. The Russians, with control over Novokoshentinivka, expand their zone of control here west of Koshentinivka, where we see that the objective is to expand along the border area, widening the front line, and at the same time to open the road towards Yastrubine in the western direction, securing the western flank of the road down to Khutin, which is a target of the offensive operations going further south. We see that the Russians are looking to expand offensive operations along the Sumy region, widening the front line and going deeper and deeper as they continue offensive operations in this section of the front line. In turn, the Ukrainians continued offensive operations within the Kursk region, where the Russians managed to regain control over some of the water treatment plants here along the border area, while the Ukrainians in turn are launching operations to widen their offensive, attacking in the direction of the rear of Tetkino and in the direction of Seria and Sorino in the east. The Ukrainians are looking to cut off the roads leading into Tetkino. By cutting off these roads, they'll be able to encircle the Russian forces within the frontline positions along Popovo-Lysashi and Tetkino, while the Ukrainians also storming the town head-on from the southwest through the town of Ryshivka, which is connected to Tetkino through the border area. The operations by the Ukrainians here in the direction of Tetkino reminds a lot of what the Russians usually do by attacking the flanks, cutting off the supplies, and putting siege to the town. They're increasing their odds of successfully taking control of it. After weeks of storming it directly head-on, the Ukrainians have been unable to gain more than a small foothold within the town. Now that they are flanking the town, they may see a more success, so have to see whether the Russians will be able to launch proper countertanks to secure the flanks and supply lines, or if the Ukrainians will be able to operationally encircle the town or completely encircle it, which will significantly increase their odds of gaining control of it and developing offensive operations into the Kursk region. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.